Welcome to the podcast Scattered, one person's search for the story behind scattered remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I speak about searching for and the discovery and recovery of dispersed remains from outdoor contexts. I offer new perspectives and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with valuable information on a subject that isn't talked about, doesn't seem to be a priority, and that is very understudied. I hope you enjoy. Hi everyone, just a few notes before we get into the interview portion. I am slowly creating summary videos of last year's scavenging study sites. That's 2021 through 2022. If you're interested, you can find them at yvonnechorlin.com/scavenging project. I am curious to hear what you learn from them and what you found helpful. Also, this is the last episode before Christmas break. I hope you all have a restful holiday season. And in the meantime, if you have any suggestions on what you'd like to hear on the podcast, let me know. I'm always open to hear what you'd like to learn about. And if you have any stories about working with the dead or next of kin, just go to my website, yvonnechorlin.com, and you'll find a contact form there and reach out. I would love to hear from you. Now, on with the interview.
So do you want me to say my name and like what my role is, or?
Yeah, give us the full spiel of who Dr. Shari Forbes is.
Sure. My name is Shari Forbes. I'm a professor and Canada 150 research chair in Forensic Thanatology at the University of Quebec in Trois-Rivières.
Soon to be at?
Soon I will be moving to the University of Windsor in Ontario. And hopefully we'll be starting, well, I'm currently the director of Canada's only human decomposition facility in Bécancour, Quebec. And we're hoping in the future that we'll open a new facility somewhere in the region of University of Windsor in Ontario to have the second facility in Canada.
So right now you have the only decompositional facility in Canada.
Yes, that's correct. Or only facility that is allowed to use human cadavers for decomposition research. So there's lots of facilities that use pig remains as analogues for human decomposition, as did I for many years when I was previously in Canada. But as of 2020, we opened what's known as the REST facility, which is, yes, the only facility that's allowed to have human cadavers donated for the purposes of studying human decomposition processes.
And just for, I don't know, clarification, edification, whatever, I was always under the impression that the body farm in Tennessee that was started by Dr. Bill Bass back in, I don't know, what was it, the 80s or whatever it was, that was the only one kind of in North America, but that's not true. There's actually quite a few of these facilities in North America, correct?
Nowadays, there is quite a few of we call them human decomposition facilities or human taphonomy facilities. So the first one definitely was opened by Dr. Bill Bass in, I think, 1981, but it's going back a long way. And then there weren't any more for a very long time, probably about 25 years. And then in the early 2000s, more facilities started to open. And at last count, I believe we are now up to 13 facilities that are officially open. Our one in Canada, one in Australia that I formally opened, one in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and then the other 10 are all based in the United States of America. So they have quite a prevalence there, whereas the rest of the world is somewhat limited as to where the other locations are.
So because of this sort of bias towards having these facilities in the U.S., do you find that then the research and the literature is biased towards research in the U.S. regarding human decomp?
It's certainly regarding human decomposition, yes. I mean, most of the data that has been published has definitely come out of the US facilities. We have published a little bit from the Australia facility. It opened in 2016, so we're now going on, 6 years? So there is definitely data coming out of that facility. The Amsterdam facility only opened in 2018, and our facility in Canada was 2020. So obviously we're still collecting data, but we haven't had time to publish a lot of that yet. So presently I would say it's definitely skewed towards the US. The good thing about the US is they cover a pretty good range of geographical climates. So even though it might be skewed to that as a region of the world, it does still cover a few different climates that could be to a degree extrapolated to comparable climates elsewhere in the world.
And so what kind of research do you do at your human decomp facility, and that maybe that everybody does at their human decomp facilities? Why are these in existence? What are they used for?
Well, traditionally, the facilities usually or typically have started in forensic anthropology programs. Certainly the original one in Tennessee is based on that, but most of them are in the US, with the intent of studying the process of human decomposition to assist with human identification, to assist with search and recovery of human remains, to assist with estimating time since death or post-mortem interval, but also ultimately to build a skeletal collection, which can be used for the teaching of forensic anthropology students. So that's where they really have traditionally focused. That's not to say that's all they do, but the facilities outside of the US have different foci because the people who lead them, such as myself, are not forensic anthropologists. So I'm a forensic chemist. I work with human remains detection dogs, and I'm interested from my specific research in understanding decomposition odor and the chemical compounds in that odor that the dogs use to locate human remains. So that's just one area. But now I would say that most of these facilities, including ours, are very multidisciplinary. So it's gone well beyond forensic anthropology and archaeology. And if you can think of a project, it's probably being done at the facilities. So looking at DNA degradation or, other primary identifiers like fingerprint degradation, dental records, or like forensic odontology. We have lots of people looking at bacteria and microbiomes or soil bacteria. So we have a lot of people working on the environment surrounding the body as well. They're quite diverse. It's hard to say exactly what we do, but me specifically, I work on decomposition odor as it relates to human remains detection dogs.
And because of the foci of these facilities and the research within, and because these facilities use humans, then the facilities are usually fenced off. They don't want living people or scavengers within them.
That's right. Mostly, we definitely don't want living people who are not meant to be there. So particularly for the respect and the privacy of the people who have donated their bodies, all of these facilities are what we would call high security facilities. So only authorized users can actually enter the fence, the security fence that surrounds the facility. So yes, we do want to prevent unauthorized human activity, but to a degree, we're also preventing, other vertebrate scavengers, I guess, and even avian scavengers, from the air, not just from the ground. So obviously that's a little bit of an issue because we do know scavenging is a huge taphonomic component of decomposition, but it is necessary for multiple reasons, predominantly to maintain the integrity of the donor and ensure that their remains are staying within that sort of authorized space for research and training.
It's difficult to study variables in this sort of like in the area of human decomposition when you're in a naturalistic context, because there are so many variables and you don't know what influences another. It's hard to separate them
That's
to study them.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, I think, with these facilities is we try to keep them very natural, like a natural environment. So those variables can just do their thing, they can just be there and be acting on the body. But often the studies within these facilities are trying to focus on just one of those variables, such as insect activity, for example, or such as microbiome, bacterial activity. But we can never really isolate all the other variables that are acting on the body. So we tend to just focus on a variable without actually isolating it. And you kind of have to make some interpretation about how all those other variables are acting on the body at the same time. So that's certainly one of the challenges of these facilities.
So then all of that would kind of lead to what you're doing now. So let's go to kind of the impetus for what you and I are doing now with the scavenging project. So how did that all start off? Since you're a chemist working at a human decompositional facility that is fenced off, but yet you're working with law enforcement, human detection dog handlers and their dogs.
Yeah, so it's it's kind of a complicated answer, but it's it made sense when I suggested doing it. So yes, I'm a forensic chemist and I look at decomposition odor, but I also more broadly classify myself as a forensic taphonomist, which means I'm interested in any taphonomic impact on the body. And as we just said, vertebrates are certainly one of those taphonomic impacts or can have a taphonomic impact on the body. And the way this project came around, obviously we can't study scavengers within our human decomposition facility. So that's an example of where we use an animal analogue such as pig remains to try and study what scavengers are present in an environment. And it came to me through my connection with the human remains detection dog handlers, because they were asking me a lot of questions around, how far should we search if a body's been scavenged and the remains are dispersed? Or, are there certain patterns that we could follow when we're searching? If we knew what scavengers were here, would they go in a certain direction? Would they travel a certain distance? All these questions were coming up. And they were asking me because I study decomposition, so they kind of just assumed I would know. And so I looked into the literature and realised there was very little work. Your study was definitely the primary one out there. And a former postdoc I had who did some work in Southern Ontario. So we had, I don't know if you call it Central Alberta for Edmonton, where you study Central Alberta and Southern Ontario. And that was kind of almost it. There was one or two other more anecdotal studies. And I thought those are really fairly small pockets when we look at the size of Canada. And there's clearly a gaping hole in terms of, needing this information. But specifically for the dog handlers who are asking me, they were in Central and Northern Ontario. So even our previous work in Southern Ontario wasn't going to be helpful to them. And so that's how it all came around. So I said, look, we can't do this research in Quebec for multiple reasons. We can't use our human remains, as I've already indicated, but also doing it in Quebec won't help you because you're in Central and Northern Ontario and the scavenging guild's going to be different. And that's kind of how it started. We said, okay, well, we can use pig remains. We can put them literally right in the areas you search. So we know we're getting accurate data for you. And it's just kind of built from there because I work with human remains detection dog handlers right across Canada. As I started presenting the research from Ontario, then more and more police services became interested and wanted to, recreate it in their specific region so that the data was accurate to them. And so that's, how you and I got into this in Alberta, which is a long way from Ontario.
But still, I mean, it's work that needs to be done because, you and I have discussed, there's so much land, so much topography in Canada and in the world that you could do this study, multiple times, and that's just, in whatever time frame you have. So let's say, you covered the entire area in Canada 1 year, you could replicate it the next year and get completely different results.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we're finding. Even just doing it in different seasons in the same location is definitely going to change the results. But inter and intra year, there's huge variability. So we kind of try and do both. We try and look at different seasonal impacts within the year, and then we try and look at those same seasons across different years to see, are we getting a good data set, and what are the trends that we can pull out of that data set? Because otherwise there is that risk of having, 1 year of anomalous data that is not truly representative of what would typically happen. So we've been doing this study now, I guess, this is the third year we did it this year. We started in 2020. And each year we kind of just, add seasons or add new locations to keep building that data set across the different regions of Canada.
And sorry, the third, I'm losing track of Ontario versus Alberta. How many years have you been doing it in Ontario now? Because you've got, spring, summer, fall in Ontario?
We did spring, summer, fall in Ontario for 2020 into 2021. And we also did spring and fall in 2021 and 2022 for different regions of Ontario. So this was our third year in Ontario, and it was our second year in Alberta, and our first year in Saskatchewan and British Columbia. We added those two as well. And of course, I forgot we started all of this in Quebec just as a pilot study, right around the human decomposition facility, just to test the method before we even commenced in Ontario. So, yeah.
Right. And this was initially all with the municipal, or I guess provincial police in Ontario, and their dog handlers, their human detection handlers.
Yeah, so that was who initiated it, the Ontario Provincial Police Canine Unit. That's who I work most closely with because they have the largest number of HRD dog handlers, or they did have. RCMP now has a comparable number, but they were the ones asking me all the questions. So that's absolutely where we started. After we tested the method in Quebec, we started with the handlers' regions, where, the regions of the handlers who are asking the questions to address them specifically. And then we moved into Alberta with the Calgary Police and Edmonton Police Service. And then RCMP has recently become involved in BC and also offered to help in the Saskatchewan location as well.
And words cannot describe my enthusiasm at finally getting the RCMP on board.
Yeah, so it's always a challenge working with any government organisation. But the nice thing about this project is we're really covering really all levels. So even we have the provincial polices definitely in terms of Ontario, but with Calgary and Edmonton, it's more regional or local city police services. The RCMP being a federal level, but even in Ontario, a lot of our handlers are just more local or regional services around Toronto, and they're also really involved and interested in this research. So it's very multi-jurisdictional in terms of its collaboration, I would say, which is usually very difficult, as you're implying. Yeah.
Yes, it's very difficult, and I'm just glad. I think it's amazing how far this project has come in the 3 years you've been doing it. It's really impressive.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I can't take any credit for it. Really, it's very much the enthusiasm of the police organisations. And every time I present this, another organisation comes on board, or another group within that organisation. We started with the canine handlers, but we're now including, missing persons unit, homicide unit, forensic ident officers, yourself, and other forensic anthropologists. And this only works because of all that input and all that involvement and the enthusiasm of all these people who give up their time to do it. Otherwise, I think this would have just, started and finished in Ontario had we not had that kind of interest from across Canada.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about what we're finding.
A lot.
I know. We're drowning in data. At least I am, just from Alberta. I'm drowning in data.
Yeah, no, so am I.
So I was looking at the paper that you published from the Ontario stuff, the Scavenger Guilds. I'm just going to say the title here. So this was published just this July. Well, actually,
Yes.
August 2022 in, where are we here? Journal of Forensic Sciences. Seasonal impact of scavenger guilds as taphonomic agents in central and northern Ontario, Canada.
Yes. And so that's the publication that resulted from that very first year where we looked at the seasonal impact. So we started in summer 2020, included fall of 2020 and spring of 2021. So it kind of spanned the 2 years, but the 4 seasons. And yeah, as you say, drowning in data, it took us that long to interpret the data and publish it, but that is just the reality of publishing research data.
Okay, well, let's just go over what you found from that, and then we'll, kind of go into preliminary stuff for what we're finding right now, including Alberta and the current Ontario stuff. So from the initial trials in Ontario that are in your paper, you talk about the scavenger guild that is there, which is different than we're finding in Alberta.
Yes, definitely.
So that's one thing. So that's good to know that there are different guilds. There is seasonal and temperature variation, which can impact what scavengers show up and when.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And also, that there seems to be a relationship between avian scavengers and mammalian scavengers.
We think so, and that's an example of where it's important to test these things over time because you can certainly hypothesize something based on one set of data, but it's important to see if this is actually correct or if we can actually prove that hypothesis by studying it over time. So, but yeah, I can come back to that. I'll try and do it in the order that we just discussed it. So in terms of scavenger guild, very broadly, without having to read the paper, I guess our most prevalent scavengers were avian, and they were the turkey vulture, which is just everywhere in Ontario, and ravens and crows, which again are just everywhere as well. We did have quite some activity, I won't say a lot, but some activity of bald eagles. And that was really interesting because that demonstrated to us a kind of hierarchy that occurs in the bird kingdom, if you want to call it that, not from a biological sense, but just in terms of size, because the vultures and the crows and the ravens would show up very quickly to a body. But once the bald eagles came, they kind of got pushed to the side. The bald eagle definitely had the hierarchy there. And they feed very differently. So that was quite interesting as well, whereas the vultures and the ravens and the crows would kind of peck and try and put holes in the body to pull internal organs and soft tissue out. Once the bald eagles arrived, they could actually just tear open the skin and very quickly access the organs and the soft tissues. And what that did was also allow a greater access point for the other birds to also feed. So that was really interesting behaviour that we observed, and we've seen that fairly repeatedly across the years in Ontario and the different locations. And then from a mammalian point of view, the most prevalent scavenger, and again, pretty much all over Ontario, I would say, is the coyote. And they have more of a tendency to feed on their own in Ontario, like just a solo coyote coming to the carcass. And we did actually look at, if it's in a forest versus if it's in a more open area without a tree canopy, is that going to change things? And from a coyote perspective, it definitely did. We found the coyote would drag the carcass into the forested area. Even if it was already in a forest, it would drag it into a more forested area, if that makes sense, just to have that safety around it so that it could see if anything else was approaching whilst it was feeding. So I guess that was our primary finding in terms of the most prevalent scavengers. And when I say prevalent, I mean the number of times they came to the body and how long they fed for. We call that kind of feeding intensity. That was fairly consistent across all the sites we studied in central and central northern Ontario, I guess. Not northwestern, that's a separate study we haven't published yet. And then we just had some other small mammals, and they were particularly interesting because this was where seasonal impact came in. So, in the summer, the body smells pretty bad pretty quickly. That attracts the turkey vultures. And then the presence of all the birds seems to attract the coyotes and maybe some other animals. And so the scavenging is very quick, meaning they kind of, consume all the soft tissue and even some of the bone and disperse it very quickly. When we moved into the fall of that same year, things were not as quick. And there were also some key scavengers missing, such as the turkey vultures, because by the time we started in fall, they'd already migrated. So actually they weren't present as a scavenger, which perhaps we didn't think about when we were doing this study. The coyotes were still there, but for whatever reason, we just saw a lot more small mammals, like the fisher, the pine marten, the fox. They just seem to be around more, and I'm yet to understand why that is. We have some hypotheses and we'll continue to test those. So that was really interesting. And then we moved into the spring, and spring was sort of in between, I think. It was not as fast as summer, but not as slow as some of the fall studies. It was a little bit more extended, which actually is quite different to what you saw in central Alberta in your spring studies. Mm-hmm. I would say they were definitely quicker in Ontario. And again, we got back to more of the birds. At that time, the vultures had come back. We were back to the vultures, the ravens, the crows, the bald eagles showing up. The small mammals were still around, but less prevalent, and the coyotes were definitely feeding as well. But what we kind of lacked in those studies were what everyone assumed would be the scavenger guild, and that's the big scavengers. Everyone assumed it was going to be bear and wolf and coyote. And in that first year of data, we didn't see bear or wolf really scavenging. We had some evidence they may have been there, but nothing to prove it. So I guess that was the surprising thing, is we all went in with some assumptions that were pretty quickly disproven. And then some things that we just didn't even think about, like small mammals or, the fact that vultures won't be there in a certain time of year, that were clearly shown in the data set.
I think that's the most fascinating thing about not just this research, but also people's perception of scattered remains and searching for dispersed remains, is that we have assumptions and we think that those will hold and that those work. But this research is showing that those assumptions usually are wrong, or they're not entirely correct at the very least.
Yeah, definitely. I think after the first year, we were thinking the assumptions were wrong. It could be because we hadn't seen bear scavenging or wolf scavenging. Now, having moved into like year 2 and year 3, where I do have evidence of bear scavenging and wolf scavenging, we can say that those assumptions were not always correct. Absolutely. So it's not to say bears and wolves don't scavenge, but they're more selective in terms of when and why they're scavenging. And I think our assumption was, well, they're the biggest, predators, scavengers, whatever, animal in the vicinity. Why wouldn't they be doing it? And that's the assumption that's incorrect. If we go to a scenario where the remains have been scavenged, and to assume instantly it's the biggest animal in the area, that is 100% going to be incorrect for sure. But more if it is one of those scavengers, if it is bear or if it is wolf, then we can ask ourselves why, because they're not the most prevalent typically in these regions. So that's been an interesting kind of question that we're trying to address. If they're there scavenging, why are they doing it? What other factors are in play there? And that's going to take more years of data for sure. But again, we have some hypotheses that are starting to give us some good results.
And that brings us into the Alberta studies, which again, us being Alberta folk, we had our assumptions. Mm-hmm. And, within the first couple of months, they're completely blown out of the water.
Yeah. And well, you probably had Albertan assumptions, and I had my assumptions coming from Ontario, because I just assumed once again the birds would be the most prevalent. They'd show up the earliest, and And you and I started this study in Calgary without me even realizing that there are no turkey vultures in Calgary. So, step number one is instantly deleted, because if you don't have that as a scavenger, they're not going to be scavenging. But even the assumption that you do have ravens, you do have crows, you have bald eagles. So we still assumed, well, they're going to be the first to the carcass, and they weren't. It was, again, the coyote. So coyote is consistently showing up as the most prevalent scavenger across all the regions I've looked at. But in Calgary and in Edmonton, it was typically the first to arrive. And I think really the only birds we got were magpies. I'm not even sure if they were feeding on the insects, the larval activity or on the tissue, but they traditionally were coming after the coyotes, which is the complete opposite of what we assumed from, the knowledge in Ontario. So, so that's why these regional studies are proving to be really beneficial, because, when a forensic anthropologist or taphonomist or anyone who's at a scene is saying, well, we believe scavengers to do this, they're probably basing that on an article they've read in a region that's completely different to them. A lot of the original scavenging data came out of Washington State and northeastern regions like Maine. And even if they're in proximity, sort of Maine is near Ontario, it's just kind of showing that doesn't mean you can have the same assumptions. Definitely from province to province, and even within the provinces, we can see huge variability in terms of what scavengers are present and when and why they're going to scavenge as well. So, it's been interesting from that perspective for sure.
And then we have a lot more bear activity in Alberta, like that grizzly that showed up within 6 hours of putting out the pig last year. I think that blew everybody. That just blew everybody's mind. That was incredible.
Yeah, for sure. And so we put out this pig, and I can only assume that grizzly was sitting there watching us, because it had barely gone dark when that bear showed up on camera. And I think at the time I assumed that was anomalous. Again, I thought, well, we just got lucky. I wanted grizzly on camera, and there I've got it, and that's never going to happen again. But as we said, by repeating these studies at the same time, a different part of Calgary, or the outskirts of Calgary for sure, but we still got, grizzly and other bears showing up pretty quickly at our Nanton site this year. Not 6 hours, but certainly within a matter of days. And again, in terms of assumptions, I really, coming out of Ontario, even when we finally got bear activity, it's black bear, obviously they don't have grizzlies, it was still, we could still justify why it was there, why we were seeing them, because their diet is 75% vegetation. So it's not really their preferred food source, if you will. Whereas with the grizzlies, it certainly looks like it's a preferred food source, because they're around, and they won't scavenge all the time, but they're definitely scavenging, and they're scavenging much quicker than the black bears in Ontario. But even the black bears in Alberta are different again as well. They also showed up in a matter of days in the middle of summer when there's ample berries and vegetation for them. And in this case, they were quite happy to feed on the pigs. Whereas in Ontario, anytime we see them, it's usually when there's limited vegetation, early in spring when there's still snow on the ground and the vegetation is not available, or late in or early fall when they're really just trying to bulk up for hibernation. So again, that behaviour in Ontario is completely different to what we're seeing in Alberta, in Calgary, or the surrounds of Calgary last year and this year. So across the provinces, we do see variability in their behaviour. The same could be said for the coyote. I mentioned that in Ontario, we almost always see it feed on its own, whereas in Calgary and Edmonton, we regularly see pairs, if not up to a family of 5, feeding at once. And I've just never seen that in Ontario. Is that to say it doesn't happen? Definitely not. But it doesn't seem to be typical at this stage based on our data.
So how is this helping us answer those questions from the HRD handlers about where to search, how far to search, etc.?
So it's still very preliminary. I mean, I have to certainly say what we're realizing is to answer that question of how far to search is actually much more complex than we thought. It's not a matter of just putting out a pig and some cameras and then going back later once it looks like it's dispersed and wandering around hoping we're going to find the remains. Even when it's actually led by somebody like yourself, a trained forensic anthropologist, that doesn't mean we're going to find 100% or even 50% of the remains. So I think at the moment, we're not answering that question. That's something you and I certainly know the complexity of that, and that we need to do more to try and get that data in the future. So for now, it's more answering that question about, which are the scavengers in my environment? What's really typical? For Edmonton, it's almost 100% coyote that they get, last year and this year. It's been pretty consistent. And I don't think any of the handlers really thought that was going to be the case. So for them to at least now, when they know when they're going to a scene and they're seeing scavenging, that if it's dispersed, it's probably coyote, then that's helpful for them. It's not to say we've given them, specific patterns at this stage. We haven't, but we do have a sense of how far they'll travel. If it's the birds, the remains are not going very far. But if it's the coyote, then they are going further. So they at least know they need to be searching a larger radius, 300, 400, even more meters, if they have the resources to do that. We're sort of more answering that question about what are the scavengers and what's their behaviour? When are they likely to feed? When will they start to disperse the remains? And, the sort of probably the stuff that's already known, that will it go down game trails? Will it sort of follow a trail? Will it be more of a fan pattern? These are the things we're kind of trying to pull out now because we can't yet give them that information about how far should I search. I mean, that's just something we're still going to work on for many years, I think.
Right. But I think you bring up a very valuable point, is that prior to these studies, maybe even prior to research in this area, a lot of, again, assumptions based on whatever, who knows, whatever, anecdotal evidence, stories, passed down stories. It seemed like it was a simple question to answer: how far to search, where to search. But now we're starting to get a glimpse of just how complex it is, and that we're more likely to say, I don't know, rather than it's this.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think, the textbook answer was 300-meter radius, 400-meter radius,
right.
You can cite who said that. But the reality is very different. We just did our search in Merritt, British Columbia, and that was the RCMP study, and we found so we have these tracking devices that we use in certain bones, to try and get a sense of how far. And as the crow flies, that was 417 meters from the deposition site. And as the crow flies was definitely not the route taken by the scavenger. I can tell you that much. Now, our route was about 800 meters. They probably had a shortcut compared to us, but I would estimate that they traveled more like, 500-600 meters at least to get the tracking. And that's where we found a small piece of bone and the tracking device. But that's not to say that, some of the other bones weren't even further than that. So we're certainly starting to understand that those theoretical radiuses are maybe not accurate once we know what the scavenger is. I mean, they can be absolutely accurate if you're talking about birds. You're probably going to find everything in, 10, 20, 30-meter radius. But once you're talking about larger or even small mammals that can, transport things up trees, into burrows, down dens, into nests, we're absolutely talking about much greater distances, and it's much more complex than what we believed. So that's future studies, absolutely.
All right. So future studies. Are you just going to keep expanding through all the provinces? And
look, ultimately, I'd love to do that. That will take me into retirement for sure. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. I guess, our data, we're sort of building our data sets in Ontario and in Alberta, and I'd like to the plan is certainly to keep doing that because we've got some good foundational data to build on from there. I mentioned we have moved into British Columbia, and we're already talking about adding sites there next year. So I think that'll be another data set to build. We have done one study in Saskatchewan, and I think long-term we'll try and do Saskatchewan and Manitoba together because, and again, here's an assumption, because they're the prairies, they're going to have similar. That's, of course, not true, but they're probably more comparable, I would argue, and easier to do because they sort of sit side by side. And then ultimately, I actually have to get east of Quebec because that's been well and truly forgotten, not intentionally, but just in terms of our police resources and partners. The sites have really been dictated by the canine handlers initially, and then forensic anthropologists who were available, and then other teams that wanted to join. So we will look to build contacts out that way. But as I said, that's going to take me into retirement for sure.
And let's not forget that if you find a wolverine.
Yes, that is true. So I tell everyone, if I ever get a wolverine on camera, I get to retire. But you know what? When I started saying that 2 years ago, that was because I thought a wolverine was like a unicorn and I'd never get it. I probably thought the same about a grizzly and a cougar, which we just got on camera. So I may have to retract that statement. I haven't. We'll probably get wolverines sooner than I'm due to retire. So then I'll up that to if I get a polar bear, then I get to retire, because that's definitely going to be more challenging, but not completely impossible. So
the sliding scale, I can see where this is going.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and for telling us about this ever expanding research. If anybody who's listening, is in Eastern Canada in the Maritimes and wants to help out with the project, please reach out to either Shari or myself. Absolutely. And we'll be happy to figure out how to get you into the fold.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me present the data today. As I said, it's all pretty preliminary, very anecdotal for now. We will get more publications out in the future, and just keep building the data set, do some more updates as well in the future. So people can hear how things are changing and what kind of trends we're identifying across the years and locations.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.